Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Book Club. We're going to be doing a play, which I'm very excited about. I looked today and it's been almost 3 years since we have done the last play, which was Slave Play by Jeremy O. Harris. And Jeremy is actually a good friend of today's guest, Will Arbery. I'm so excited for this one. I had the opportunity to meet Will. It just felt like kismet, and I fell in love with his writing and his work, and the fact that he agreed and was enthusiastic to come on here blows my mind. I wanted to do it as quickly as possible before he had time to change his mind. Will Arbery is a playwright and screenwriter from Dallas. He's known for his plays Heroes of the Fourth Turning, which I was lucky enough to see here in LA at Rogue Machine Theater, and it was also my introduction to Will's work. Heroes of the Fourth Turning was a finalist for the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for Drama, and Plano, which we'll be discussing today. Plano is a dream play about three sisters who are stricken with a series of strange plagues, time leapfrogs, and men are always disappearing. People have often described this play as unsettling. All of Will's work that I'm familiar with is beautifully unsettling. It's dry, it's funny, it's fast-paced with such a unique tone, and it's really special experience to read, or if you're lucky enough to watch Will's work. And without further ado, let's bring Will on. So I have a million questions for you, and you can answer them, and if you don't want to answer them, just say I don't want to answer that.
Okay, I can do
Okay,
that. There's
great.
probably going to be some of those with this play.
When did you start writing plays?
Technically, I started in high school. I wrote a couple of short plays that, I cast my friends in and we performed. But I only started really taking it seriously in college, like my junior year. I'd been writing other stuff and I'd been acting and I'd been directing, but then I took a playwriting class and I felt like everything come together. And I
Mhm.
was like, I think I got to do that.
Why do you think it was playwriting that ended up being your medium?
I come from a family of 10, so I have 7 sisters, and I was just surrounded by voices from a young age. And I think more than anything, that's the reason playwriting felt like the one, just like the conditions of my life. And I'm on the younger end, like I'm the second to youngest. And I felt like from the time I was a boy, I was like having to balance a lot of perspectives, just being surrounded by people. Yeah.
Was there a play that you saw or read that was formative for you?
Going to see Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. It was like the Shakespeare in Dallas. I grew up in Texas. It was like on the Shakespeare in Dallas stage, but it was backstage. So the
Mhm.
audience was sitting like backstage because the way that plays about, these side characters in Hamlet, but like,
Yeah.
so they would like
Yeah.
go onto the actual stage for the Hamlet parts and then come back. And it was cool. And I was just like,
Well,
whoa. And I just
yeah.
remember thinking, I want to do something like that. That's so smart.
You've been getting more into screenwriting over the last few years. What has that transition been like, and what prompted you to do more off stage?
So I actually was in love with film before I was in love with theater. When I was very obsessive as a boy, like first it was baseball statistics, and then it switched into movie. Like then I became like completely obsessed with movies, and I was like living. I would like print out the IMDb top 250 and like cross them off when I'd watch them. This was before Letterboxd, so we had the
Yes,
IMDb top
yes.
250. And like I would like go and rent the movies from the public library, and I was just like completely obsessed. So it was always kind of the dream to write movies and make movies, and I love TV as well. And so they never felt mutually exclusive. I was like, I'm gonna start with theater. I'm gonna move to New York. I'm gonna try to make my name in the theater. But for me, like going to film and TV was never in question. It was what I wanted to do. So yeah, I just really love all three and I wanted to pursue all three.
And how
Yeah.
does writing for pre-existing characters, like I know you have experience doing that, how does that compare to writing characters that are born from your imagination?
Yeah. So I worked on Succession and that
Full
was
show. I don't know if anyone's ever seen it.
it was really interesting, yeah, like Jesse Armstrong created those characters and he really knows them better than anybody. Like I rewatched the show like twice in its entirety and I really tried to write in their voices, but there was always, this ineffable thing that I could never quite capture. And I feel like that's a very common experience for people who are hired to write on somebody else's TV show. Like there's always like this final gap of understanding that
Yeah.
only the person who first came up with them can really fill in.
You experience that then in your plays, like when you're writing an Anne or a Genevieve or an Isabel, like you know where they live in you and maybe where they live in your life. So it's easier to pull kind of the entirety of their humanity into it.
Totally. Plano was inspired by people in my life. And so it's kind of second nature in a way. Like it's less about like how do they talk, what are the specificities of how they talk. Like if you've lived with someone your entire life, you kind of
Yes.
just know that, and it becomes much more about like, okay, what is this about, what am I wrestling with? And sometimes when I'm writing, like kind of inventing characters who are maybe sort of like an amalgamation of people, or they're just like totally new, then it slowly reveals itself. Like I'm writing something brand new. I've been working this morning on a screenplay. I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, there's several characters in here that I just like haven't discovered yet, and that just comes naturally once you work on it enough. Like they
Wow.
sort of reveal to you who they are rather than the
Yeah.
other way around.
Do you ever find that a person from your life will take the form of different characters in different things that you write, or do they usually live sort of in the one character and then you move on to somebody else?
There's like several people in my life who have inspired multiple characters. For example, my sister Monica is very generous with letting me be inspired by her. Like she inspired Isabel, but she also inspired Emily in my play Heroes of the Fourth Turning. And yeah, she's shown up a bunch. My mom has shown up a bunch. My friend Nathan. There's just like different people who these sort of like mythic figures in my mind who are so unforgettable, and they keep showing up.
Do you think that writing people into your plays or into your work brings you closer to them?
I hope so. I can't possibly know what the experience is of being written about by your son, for example, and going and seeing like a
It's
representation
brave.
of yourself. Yeah, it must be so bizarre, but it led to some really wonderful conversations, and I do think there is like a new understanding that develops from that. It's almost like the fantasy of like wondering how people see you is fulfilled, like,
Yes.
oh, that's kind of how they see me. Okay, but it's tricky, and it requires like diplomacy, and it requires care and a level of vulnerability and transparency that in and of itself leads to more closeness beyond the representation. It's just like the act of telling them that you've written about them like creates a new closeness, hopefully.
Watching Heroes and then watching Plano, there is this mother figure that comes in at the end of both. What does that symbolize for you?
Like my instinct to bring her in that late.
Mhm.
Both of those plays sort of were being written at the same time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and they both had New York productions in 2019, and it was funny. It's like in Plano, there's the mom character who comes in like two-thirds of the way in, and she keeps talking about this tiny world she and her husband have been building, and she like opens this little box and like this is our tiny world, and they look at it, and then she closes it. And during that time, I was sort of joking, but sort of not, that like Heroes is the tiny world that she's showing them in the box.
Wow.
It's like going into that world. And I don't know, I think that the impulse to have her come in like two-thirds of the way through is like both plays are about young people in very different ways, like searching for meaning and searching for some like coherence. And she sort of comes in as like what seems like an authority figure who's going to solve everything, but then actually kind of makes everything more complicated.
You said in an interview that Plano is about time moving so fast you don't have time to think, and dying while you're still alive and not being able to help the people you love. Can you expand on that?
Those are three very like separate but linked ideas, I guess. Yeah, I would say that like the initial impulse was that idea of dying while you're still alive. At the time, there was people I was very close to who underwent these transformations that felt so shocking, and it felt like they became a completely different person. I guess in retrospect, it was just, a marriage breaking up or a
Yeah.
midlife crisis. But to me, it felt like their body was still walking around and breathing and moving in the world, but they had sort of died or sort of been split in two. And so that's where that initial impulse came in Plano, where the character of Steve splits in two. And it was such a psychic wound that I just had to write to work through, and I sort of just like literalized the metaphor of that, like took that feeling and just made it literal and very
Yes.
theatrical on stage. So that was sort of the initial impulse. And then the feeling of time moving very fast and not being able to help the people you love. That just came out of being a brother to these sisters, and being, in New York or in LA or in Chicago, and, beginning my life, but also still feeling very rooted to Texas and Dallas, not quite feeling like I was, out of that space yet. Like I was still sort of halfway there. Like I was still a boy, like who helped out and observed and was just like a part of the fabric of that. And I was also trying to become a man. And so it sort of came out of that place of how much of this am I really a part of anymore? And it's like reaching for these people that I love and trying to help, but not knowing how. And yeah,
Yeah.
so it came out of that big confusing feeling.
There's a trope you use over and over again where you say, I'll tell you about it later. It's later. I don't want to talk about it. Or, okay, I'll introduce him later. It's later. Here he is, which I've never seen anything like that depicted in theater or anywhere else for that matter. How did you come up with time hopping this way?
It just came out immediately as I started writing. I was trying to find a really clean way to depict what this felt like. You know, your sisters going through a crisis, their marriage is breaking up. How I was experiencing it felt like an onslaught of new information every day. But of course, it was weeks, it was months, it was years, you know. So that feeling of trying to catch up, that feeling of, I think in retrospect, a lot of like repression, a lot of avoidance, like not really talking about what we needed to be talking about, sort of the like slow drip of information that can sometimes happen in a family, like, oh, what happened? Why didn't they tell me? You know, especially in a family of 10, like it gets
Yeah.
confusing. And so it just came out really, really intuitively when I first started writing the play. It just sort of came out that way. And I ran with it. Sometimes when I'm starting a play or like really trying to get at something, like when you have a topic for something, there are the sort of the scenes that you could write that are expected. Those are like kind of boring, but you kind of know in your head what they look like. And then there's like the way it actually felt. And sometimes I'll hit a block with something and I'll be like, I don't want to write those scenes that you would expect to see. So I'm just going to write. Really, it comes out of I'm going to write it poorly. Like I'm going to try to write this just bad version of this, you know,
You
which is
failed
like
at doing.
but it's good advice because it can really free you up. It's like, okay, I'm not going to try to make this good. I'm just going to try to tell the truth. And you can actually really get out of your own way when you do it that way. And some good writing can come of it.
And I feel like your pacing is so unique and quick, but when you actually break it down, there's such a depth of meaning injected into so many of the lines. How do you maintain a fast pace while also emphasizing the importance of the themes in your play? Or do you think that the pacing actually aids in that emphasis?
Every play is different and every play breathes its own rhythm. That's very important to me. Like my play Corsicana, for example, is a much different pace because it's following a very different set of characters. The air that they're breathing, I think, is like it's summer, it's like stickier, it's, you know, and this sort of takes place in this time beyond time where it's just constantly barreling forward. Pace and rhythm and breath are extremely important for every play that I write. They're kind of one of the first things. Like I'm always trying to find a flow when I'm writing, and when I haven't found a flow state with it yet, where it's like you can almost write a whole draft in a day. That's what I'm constantly looking for. I know that there's something I haven't cracked about the rhythm yet. For this one, it felt like, okay, pretty early on, I knew that it had to really fly, that was sort of just how it had to feel. That was what the experience of this play, if I was
Yeah.
like an audience member sitting in watching this, had to sort of be like on the edge of their seat, making sure they were catching every word and feeling always like it was just out of reach because it was going so fast, you know?
Yes. Do you feel like as a playwright, you have to think about the audience, or does that feel like something that comes after?
I think about the audience a lot, to be honest. That's the whole point, I think, like of writing plays. I mean, films are different, TV is different. I mean, there's a different relationship to the audience, but with theater, I mean, you're literally writing an experience. I'm really thinking about what it's going to be like to sit in that audience. It's important to me.
How do you feel like your backstory influences your writing? Like, do you still feel a connection to Texas?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I haven't lived there in a long time, but I don't know. I don't know why I keep saying it. Like, I grew up in Dallas, in Oak Cliff.
Mm.
I have another play that we're workshopping right now and trying to get a production for, and that takes place again in like a suburb of Dallas. Yeah. There's Plano, Corsicana, which is like an hour south of Dallas. This new play is going to take place in Frisco, which is like an hour north of Dallas. And I don't know why I keep saying these plays like on the outskirts of this. It's like I'm like circling closer and closer.
Why do you think you chose Plano as the place that men go to split into pieces?
Honestly, I don't, yeah, anyone watching who's from Plano, like no offense to them, but like growing up in Dallas, Plano just always felt like such a weird place that sort of just sprang out of the dry, flat earth. It's just a place with like a lot of developments, a lot of like McMansions and, you know, just identical looking houses and identical looking strip malls. It's very suburb. It's like a fascinating place. And I think honestly, it just came out of around when this was all happening, like there was some sort of anecdote about like my sister was saying that her husband was with the kids in Plano and they were on the phone and he was having some sort of panic attack. And I think it came out of that, like, oh, Plano as a sort of like random hell. There's even a line in the play that calls it a random hell. It's just a very banal suburb in this sprawling metroplex, and it just felt right.
I think there's a significance to choosing to have three sisters in this. Like, why did you choose three as opposed to seven or another number?
I went back and forth on that. I did so many drafts of that play, and there were definitely times when I would try to like reveal at some point, like, there's four more sisters and there's a brother, and like really acknowledge the real world inspiration for it. But then I just decided to just keep it a little simpler, not try to distract too much. And there's also the parallel with Chekhov's Three Sisters, which felt, at least interesting in some way, just to like crackle a little bit that feeling of yearning for Moscow. But in this case, it's sort of inverted and it's sort of warped. It's like
Yeah.
Plano is not Moscow. None of them want to go there, but people keep
Yeah.
disappearing to there, and they're sort of trapped on this porch. And it felt like it was in conversation with Chekhov a little bit.
How do you think growing up in a predominantly female household has informed how you write women?
Tremendously, I guess. I went to an all boys Catholic school. I was there for 8 years. So I was going back and forth from a super female environment to a super male environment. I think one thing I noticed that was different was just, for me, it wasn't like they were women. They were just people. Like, my sort of baseline understanding of what a person was a woman. It honestly just had the effect of like demystifying it completely. And when I write female characters, I don't think of it as like writing a female character. It's just this person that I'm interested in.
Women in literature have been defined by the men they love or by the absence of the men they love. Do you believe that Plano is about women, or do you think it's about the absence of men?
I mean, I think it's about both. If you read the play, there's no way getting around that the idea of maleness and men is like this. It's this haunting. It's this menace that's growing and building and transforming constantly around them. And that was in large part inspired by my own sort of grappling with what it meant to be a man. One effect that came from having all those sisters was that it created this interesting pressure on my relationship with my father. I was his only son, and it was like, okay, well, what's this gonna be? And also created in me this obsession with the idea of like, what even is a man? What is masculinity? Do I have to do that? Like,
Do I
what
have to participate in that?
do I have to participate in that? Like, feeling like I was coming up short, or just general confusion around it that persists to this day. Yeah, I think Plano was in large part written out of that, like a sort of fear, like a dread around my own maleness, and kind of working through the different ways that men can harm the women that they say they care about. And that can be through abstinence, it could be through aggression, it can be through all sorts of different things. And I was really just trying to like come to terms with all of it. I was also trying to write fully and compassionately and complexly about these women that I care about. But there's no way of getting around. Yeah, it's just sort of both.
I love Isabel's speech when she says, "You locked me in a room with God. You said, here's a God who loves you, but you didn't tell me it might be a God who hates me too or ignores me." When did you start feeling like capable of exploring something that was so deeply embedded into the way that you were raised?
When I first started writing plays, I sort of started from a place of what I knew, which was Catholics and conservatives and Texans and family, And then I got afraid. I got afraid of writing that stuff because they were about real people and I didn't want the people to see them. That felt like a violation. So when I moved to New York, I started writing wild things, plays about like Justin Bieber and cannibals, and plays about any wild idea I could come up with. Yeah, I wrote this play about Justin Bieber being locked in an attic with a French cannibal, like based on this real guy named Terrar. And it's like this weird,
Oh,
I don't know. Yeah,
when you said
Selena
Justin Bieber
Gomez
and
was a character.
cannibals, I was like, is this two separate plays or the same?
No,
It's
same
not
play.
the same
Same
play.
play.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
I was experimenting. And then at a certain point in the process of writing a ton and wanting to be a better playwright, I just started writing more personally. And that came out of like frustration and stagnation, like wanting to break free of the bad sort of writerly habits that I was developing. I went to grad school at Northwestern, and one of the things that a professor told me in my like exit interview was like, you're doing great work, but beware of being too writerly. I knew what she meant. There was sort of like a cleverness, like, oh, this would be an interesting idea. This would be an interesting idea. And so it was sort of trying to move through that and just trying to get to a place of brutal honesty and truth. That's why eventually I circled back to writing about Catholicism. And now it's like very clear to me that that's like faith and belief systems and people searching for meaning is my lifelong interest,
It's so
Yeah.
scary because I feel like you can't write truthfully about the people that you love without also then having to explore your own stuff and get into your own thing. So it is quite scary.
Totally.
How much do you think Catholicism has shaped your writing versus how much do you think your writing has now shaped your relationship with Catholicism today?
It's a great question. I was just talking about this recently. There's something mass-like about the way that theater exists. Like, I think I'm drawn to the literal experience of going to the theater because of going to mass as a kid and sort of the orientation of your body, like pews and seats in the theater being directed towards this thing at the front and, the aisle and all of it. What gets complicated is that if I'm creating an experience that's like the Catholic Mass, then that means that I'm sort of trying to play God and create this liturgy for people to go and receive. And that I'm uncomfortable with that. I don't want that to be my role. I want it to be much more democratic, but there's no denying that like the author does like create these characters, create this experience and put them through things. And I'm constantly working through that. And I think that in my writing, it sort of always gets to this place where I kind of surrender to something unknowable and something bigger. Like I never want to end a play being like, and this is what I know, and this is what I think you should know too, and this is what I think you should take away. I want it to feel like there's 1,000,000,000 possibilities of what you could take away. Like something bigger has been like invited into the space, and you can do what you want with that.
The New Yorker once wrote about Plano, what truly makes it work, though, is that it's surreal in ways that could be conveyed only on the stage. Do you think that's true for all plays? That it's like an experience that you have to go, like you mentioned, kind of like going to mass, that being there sort of is the only way to experience it to its fullest? Or do you think you can get that also from reading?
It's never going to be the same. Obviously, like I write plays to be performed. They haven't gone through a rehearsal process and a tech and previews and like audience coming, then they're unfinished to me. Like they haven't been fully written. And even like on the page in the published versions, that's like an invitation to me. It's not the final thing. Hopefully it inspires you to want to do it or be in it or, like see it. Reading a play is a unique experience and some people don't enjoy it. I don't enjoy it a lot of the time, because a novel can sort of like pull you in and you can feel like you're moving through it. And a play, strangely, like it feels like there's like a remove, like the format, what you're asked to wrap your mind around and how much information you're supposed to be taking in at the same time. These things that happen automatically when you sit down and watch it, you have to do that work when you're reading it. It's different.
What is the experience like of watching your work be interpreted by so many different people, especially when you're writing about such personal topics like in Plano? Is there a process of letting go you have to do?
Yeah, you have to let go. It's hard to let go because when an audience starts coming in and having their reactions, and when critics start coming in and having their reactions, it can feel like it could feel so jarring. It's like, I mean, you've been building something for weeks, months with collaborators. Inevitably, like you're bonding, you're getting so close with each other, you're finding all these beautiful things, and then people come in and are just sort of like want to be entertained or want, have some sort of expectation about what they're going to receive, and the energy just completely changes. That experience of letting go it's sad. I've said some dark things about it in the past, like doing a play is just watching a beautiful thing die, which is so dramatic.
No, but I feel like it must feel a little bit like, how did these strangers get into my house?
We invite them, we want them. Yeah.
Yes, well, we also need them. Okay, I'm actually currently reading a book that you recommended to me, which I love. Do you have any book recommendations? One, and then two, what is the book that you've gifted to people the most?
Wait, what book did I recommend to you?
Marriage Plot.
Oh,
I
cool.
love it.
Okay.
I'm halfway through. It's so good.
Oh yeah, it is so good. And the ending is really good. Yeah, people sleep on the marriage plot. Yeah, the book that I would recommend to people right now was recommended to me by Gia Tolentino, and it's called When We Cease to Understand the World by Benjamin Labatut. Labatut is his name. But yeah, it's called When We Cease to Understand the World. It's sort of this book that like fuses nonfiction with fiction, and it sort of becomes more fiction as it goes along, but a shocking amount of it is true. It's about like that quest for meaning. It's about scientists and mathematicians and eccentric, brilliant people who are trying to get as close as they can to an understanding of all of it, like the greatest mysteries of why we're here, and sort of where that touches madness and where that touches obsession, and when it just sort of has to surrender to incoherence. It's an awesome book.
We love Gia too. I trust anything that Gia recommends. She was, I think, like the second book club guest that I ever had.
Yeah, she's great. I always trust her recommendations. And what book do I give to people the most? There's this really good book. It's called Everything That Rises, A Book of Convergences. It's by Lawrence Weschler. I think McSweeney's published it, so it's kind of hard to find. I hope they're still like printing a lot of it because I think it's
Yeah.
great, but it's basically about convergences in the culture, in his personal life, and there's these beautiful images and these like paintings, works of art, things from history. Like another one of those uncategorizable books that just blows your mind
Yeah.
and makes you appreciate everything.
Thank you for like doing this. I'm very excited. And I'm so into the marriage plot. Like I haven't been able to put it down. It's a sickness. I'll text you when I'm done with it. And good luck with all the award stuff. I'm sure it's like nuts.
Thank you for this. This was so fun.
See you.